12. When I first met Tamara, to give her a name concurrent with her real one, she was 15 and I was a year older. The place was the rugged but comely country, black fir, white birch, peat bogs, hayfields, and barrens just south of St. Petersburg. A distant war was dragging on. 2 years later, that trite Deus ex machina, the Russian Revolution, came, causing my removal from the unforgettable scenery. In fact, already then, in July 1915, dim omens and backstage rumblings, the hot breath of fabulous upheavals, were affecting the so-called symbolist school of Russian poetry, especially the verse of Alexander Blok. During the beginning of that summer and all through the previous one, Tamara's name had kept cropping up with the faint naivete so typical of fate when meaning business. Here and there on our estate, entry forbidden, and on my uncle's land, entry strictly forbidden. On the opposite bank of the Oradej, I would find it written with a stick on the reddish sand of a park avenue, or penciled on a whitewashed wicket, or freshly carved but not completed in the wood of some ancient bench, as if Mother Nature were giving me mysterious advance notices of tomorrow's existence. That hushed July afternoon, when I discovered her standing quite still, only her eyes were moving, in a birch grove, she seemed to have been spontaneously generated there, among those watchful trees, with the silent completeness of a mythological manifestation. She slapped dead the horsefly that she had been waiting for to light, and proceeded to catch up with 2 other, less pretty girls who were calling to her. Presently, from a vantage point above the river, I saw them walking over the bridge, clicking along on brisk high heels, all 3 with their hands tucked into the pockets of their navy blue jackets, and because of the flies, every now and then tossing their beribboned and beflowered heads. Very soon I traced Tamara to the modest dachka, summer cottage, that her family rented in the village. I would ride my horse or my bicycle in the vicinity, and with the sudden sensation of a dazzling explosion, after which my heart would take quite a time to get back from where it had landed, I used to come across Tamara at this or that bland bend of the road. Mother Nature eliminated first one of her girl companions, then the other, but not until August 9, 1915, to be patriarchally exact, at 4:30 of that season's fairest afternoon in the rainbow-windowed pavilion, that I had noticed my trespasser enter. Not until then did I muster sufficient courage to speak to her. Seen through the carefully wiped lenses of time, the beauty of her face is as near and as glowing as ever. She was short and a trifle on the plump side, but very graceful, with her slim ankles and supple waist. A drop of Tartar Circassian blood might have accounted for the slight slant of her merry dark eye and the duskiness of her blooming cheek. A light down akin to that found on fruit of the almond group lined her profile with a fine rim of radiance. She accused her rich brown hair of being unruly and oppressive, and threatened to have it bobbed, and did have it bobbed a year later, but I always recall it as it looked first, fiercely braided into a thick plait that was looped up at the back of her head, and tied there with a big bow of black silk. Her lovely neck was always bare, even in winter in St. Petersburg, for she had managed to obtain permission to eschew the stifling color of a Russian schoolgirl's uniform. Whenever she made a funny remark or produced a jingle from her vast store of minor poetry, she had a most winning way of dilating her nostrils with a little snort of amusement. Still, I was never quite sure when she was serious and when she was not. The rippling of her ready laughter, her rapid speech, the roll of her very uvular R, the tender moist gleam on her lower eyelid, indeed, all her features were ecstatically fascinating to me. But somehow or other, instead of divulging her person, they tended to form a brilliant veil in which I got entangled every time I tried to learn more about her. When I used to tell her we would marry in the last days of 1917, as soon as I had finished school, she would quietly call me a fool. I visualized her home, but vaguely. Her mother's first name and patronymic, which were all I knew of the woman, had merchant class or clerical connotations. Her father, who I gathered took hardly any interest in his family, was the steward of a large estate somewhere in the south. Autumn came early that year. layers of fallen leaves piled up ankle-deep by the end of August. Velvet black Camberwell beauties with creamy borders sailed through the glades. The tutor to whose erratic care my brother and I were entrusted that season used to hide in the bushes in order to spy upon Tamara and me, with the aid of an old telescope he had found in the attic, but in his turn one day the peeper was observed by my uncle's purple-nosed old gardener, Apostolsky, incidentally a great tumbler of weeding girls, who very kindly reported it to my mother. She could not tolerate snooping, and besides, though I never spoke to her about Tamara, she knew all she cared to know of my romance from my poems, which I recited to her in the spirit of praiseworthy objectivity, and which she lovingly copied out in a special album. My father was away with his regiment. He did feel it his duty, after acquainting himself with the stuff, to ask me some rather awkward questions when he returned from the front a month later, but my mother's purity of heart had carried her, and was to carry her, over worse difficulties. She contented herself with shaking her head dubiously, though not untenderly, and telling the butler to leave every night some fruit for me on the lighted veranda. I took my adorable girl to all those secret spots in the woods where I had daydreamed so ardently of meeting her and creating her. In one particular pine grove, everything fell into place. I parted the fabric of fancy. I tasted reality. As my uncle was absent that year, we could also stray freely in this huge, dense, 2-century-old park, with its classical cripples of green-stained stone and the main avenue and labyrinthine paths radiating from a central fountain. We walked swinging hands country fashion. I picked dahlias for her on the borders of the gravel drive under the distant, benevolent eye of old Priapostolsky. We felt less safe when I used to see her home or near home, or at least to the village bridge. I remember the coarse graffiti linking our first names in strange diminutives on a certain white gate, and a little apart from that village idiot scrawl, the adage, "Prudence is the friend of passion," in a bristly hand well known to me. Once, at sunset, near the Orange and Black River, a young Dachshund vacationist was riding crop in his hand, bowed to her in passing, whereupon she blushed like a girl in a novel, but only said, with a spirited sneer, that he had never ridden a horse in his life. At another time, as we emerged onto a turn of a highway, my two little sisters, in their wild curiosity, almost fell out of the Red family torpedo, swerving toward the bridge. On dark, rainy evenings, I would load the lamp of my bicycle with magical lumps of calcium carbide to shield a match from the gusty wind, and having imprisoned white flame in the glass, ride cautiously into the darkness. The circle of light cast by my lamp would pick out the damp, smooth shoulder of the road between its central system of puddles and the long bordering grasses. Like a tottering ghost, the pale ray would weave across a clay bank at the turn as I began the downhill ride toward the river. Beyond the bridge, the road sloped up again to meet the Rojestveno-Luga highway, and just above that junction, a footpath among dripping jasmine bushes ascended a steep escarpment. I had to dismount and push my bicycle. As I reached the top, my livid light flitted across the 6-pillared white portico at the back of my uncle's mute, shuttered manor, as mute and shuttered as it may be today, half a century later. There, in a corner of that arched shelter, from where she had been following the zigzags of my ascending light, Tamara would be waiting, perched on the road parapet with her back to the pillar. I would put out my lamp and grope my way toward her. One is moved to speak more eloquently about these things, about many other things that one always hopes might survive captivity in the zoo of words. But the ancient limes crowding close to the house drown Mnemosyne's monologue, with their creaking and heaving in the restless night. Their sigh would subside. The rain pipe at one side of the porch, a small busy body of water, could be heard steadily bubbling. At times, some additional rustle troubling the rhythm of the rain in the leaves would cause Tamara to turn her head in the direction of an imagined footfall, and then, by a faint luminosity now rising above the horizon of memory, despite all that rain, I could distinguish the outline of her face, but there was nothing and nobody to fear, and presently she would gently exhale the breath she had held for a moment, and her eyes would close again. With the coming of winter, our reckless romance was transplanted to grim St. Petersburg. We found ourselves horribly deprived of the sylvan security we had grown accustomed to. Hotels disreputable enough to admit us stood beyond the limits of our daring, and the great era of part amours was still remote. The secrecy that had been so pleasurable in the country now became a burden, yet neither of us could face the notion that chaperoned meetings at her home or mine. Consequently, we were forced to wander a good deal about the town, she in her little gray-furred coat, I white-spatted and caracal-collared, with a knuckle-duster in my velvet-lined pocket, and this permanent quest for some kind of refuge produced an odd sense of hopelessness, which in its turn foreshadowed other much later and lonelier roamings. We skipped school. I forget what tomorrow's procedure was. Mine consisted of talking either of the two chauffeurs into dropping me at this or that corner on the way to school. Both were good sports and actually refused to accept my gold handy 5-ruble pieces coming from the bank and appetizing weighty sausages of 10 or 20 shining pieces, in the aesthetic recollection of which I can freely indulge now that my proud emigre destitution is also a thing of the past. Nor had I any trouble with our wonderful, eminently bribable Ustin, who took all the calls on our ground-floor telephone, the number of which was 2443, Dvadstat, Shitir Sorok 3. He would briskly replied, I had a sore throat. I wonder, by the way, what would happen if I put in a long-distance call from my desk right now? No answer? No such number? No such country? Or the voice of Ustin saying, Moyo Pokshtinsi, the ingratiating diminutive of my respects. There exist, after all, well-publicized Slavs and Kurds who are well over 150. My father's telephone in his study, 584-51, was not listed, and my foreign master in his attempts to learn the truth about my failing health never got anywhere. There's sometimes I missed 3 days in a row. We walked under the white lacery of begrimed avenues and public parks. We huddled together on cold benches after having removed first our tidy cover of snow, then our snow-encrusted mittens. We haunted museums. They were drowsy and deserted on weekday mornings, and very warm in contrast to the glacial haze and its red sun that like a flushed moon hung in the eastern windows. They would seek the quiet back rooms, the stopgap mythologies nobody looked at, the etchings, the medals, the paleographic items, the story of printing, sport things like that. Our best find, I think, was a small room where brooms and ladders were kept, but a batch of empty frames that suddenly started to slide and topple in the dark attracted an inquisitive art lover, and we fled. The Hermitage, St. Petersburg's Louvre, offered nice nooks, especially in a certain hall on the ground floor, among cabinets and scarabs, behind the sarcophagus of Nana, high priest of Ta, in Russian Museum of Emperor Alexander III, 2 halls, Nos 30 and 31, in its northeastern corner harboring repellently academic paintings by Shishkin, clearing in a pine forest, and by Harlamov, head of a young gypsy, offered a bit of privacy because of some tall stands with drawings, until a foul-mouthed veteran of the Turkish campaign threatened to call the police. So from those great museums we graduated to smaller ones, such as the Suvorov, for instance, where I recall the most silent room full of old armor and tapestries and torn silk banners, with several bewigged, heavily booted dummies in green uniforms standing guard over us. But wherever we went, invariably, after a few visits, this or that hoary, bleary-eyed, felt-soled attendant would grow suspicious, and we would have to go transfer our furtive frenzy elsewhere, to the pedagogical museum, to the museum of court carriages, or to a tiny museum of old maps which guidebooks do not even list, and then out again into the cold, into some lane of great gates and green lions with rings on their jaws, into the stylized snowscape of the art world, Mer Iskustva, Dobuzhinsky, Alexandra Benoit, so dear to me in those days. On late afternoons we got into the last row of seats in one of the 2 movie theaters, the Parisiana and the Piccadilly, on Nevsky Avenue. The art was progressing, sea waves were tinted a sickly blue, and as I rode in and burst into foam against a black, remembered rock, Rocher de la Vierge. Biarritz. Funny, I thought, to see again the bench of my cosmopolitan childhood. There was a special machine that imitated the sound of the surf, making a kind of washy swish that never quite managed to stop short with the scene, but for 3 or 4 seconds accompanied the next feature. A brisk funeral, say, or a shabby prisoners of war with their dapper captors. As often as not, the title of the main picture was a quotation from some popular poem or song, and might be quite long-winded, such as "The chrysanthemums blossomed no more in the garden," or "Her heart was a toy in his hands, and like a toy it got broken." Female stars had low foreheads, magnificent eyebrows, lavishly shaded eyes. The favorite actor of the day was Mazhuhin. One famous director had acquired the Moscow countryside, a white-pillared mansion, not unlike that of my uncle, and it appeared in all the pictures he made. Mazhuhin would drive up to it in a smart sleigh and fix a steely eye on a light in one window, while a celebrated little muscle twitched under the tight skin of his jaw. When museums and movie houses failed us and the night was young, we were reduced to exploring the wilderness of the world's most gaunt and enigmatic city. Solitary street lamps were metamorphosed into sea creatures with prismatic spines by the icy moisture on our eyelashes. As we crossed the vast squares, various architectural phantoms arose with silent suddenness right before us. We felt a cold thrill, generally associated not with height but with depth, with an abyss opening at one's feet. When great monolithic pillars or polished granite, polished by slaves, repolished by the moon, and rotating smoothly in the polished vacuum of the night, zoomed above us to support the mysterious rotundities of St. Isaac's Cathedral. We stopped on the brink, as it were, of these perilous massifs of stone and metal, and with linked hands, in Lilliputian awe, craned our heads to watch new colossal visions rise in our way. The tin, glossy gray Atlantis, a palace portico, or giant vase of porphyry near the iron gate of a garden, and that enormous column with a black angel on its summit that obsessed rather than adorned the moon-flooded palace square, and went up and up, trying in vain to reach the sub-base of Pushkin's Exegi Monumentum. She contended afterward, in her rare moments of moodiness, that our love had not withstood the strain of that winter. A flaw it appeared, she said. Through all those months, I had kept writing verse to her, for her, about her, 2 or 3 poems per week. In the spring of 1916, I published a collection of them, and was horrified when she drew my attention to something I had not noticed at all when concocting the book. There it was, the same ominous flaw, the banal hollow note, the glib suggestion that our love was doomed, since it could never recapture the miracle of its initial moments. The rustle and rush of those limes in the rain, the compassion of the wild countryside. Moreover, but this neither of us saw at the time, my poems were juvenile stuff, quite devoid of merit, and ought never to have been put on sale. The book, a copy of which still exists, alas, in the closed stacks of the Linen Library of Moscow, deserved what it got at the tearing claws of the few critics who noticed it in obscure periodicals. My Russian literature teacher at school, Vladimir, a first-rate, though somewhat esoteric poet, whom I greatly admired, he surpassed in talent, I think, his much better-known cousin, Zinaida Hippias, woman poet and critic, brought a copy with him to class, and provoked the delirious hilarity of the majority of my classmates by applying his fiery sarcasm, he was a fierce man with his red hair, to my most romantic lines. His famous cousin at session of the Literary Fund asked my father, its president, to tell me, please, but I would never be a writer. A well-meaning, needy, and talentless journalist who had reasons to be grateful to my father wrote an impossibly enthusiastic piece about me, some 500 lines, dripping with wholesome praise, and it was interpreted in time by my father, and I remember him and me, while we read it in the manuscript, grinding our teeth and groaning, the ritual adopted by our family when faced with something with awful taste, or by somebody's gaffe. The whole business cured me permanently of all interest in literary fame, and was probably the cause of that almost pathological and not always justified indifference to reviews, which in later years deprived me of the emotions most authors are said to experience. That spring of 1916 is the one I see as the very type of St. Petersburg spring, but I recall such specific images as Tamara wearing an unfamiliar white hat among the spectators of a hard-fought interscholastic soccer game in which that Sunday the most sparkling luck helped me to make save after save in goal, and a Camberwell beauty exactly as old as our romance, stunning its bruised black wings, their borders now bleached in hibernation, on the back of a bench in Alexandrovsky Garden, and the booming of cathedral bells in the keen air above the corrugated dark blue of the Neva, voluptuously free of ice, and the fair in the confetti-studded slush of the Horse Guard Boulevard during Catkin Week, with its squeaking and popping din, its wooden toys, its loud hawking of Turkish delight and Cartesian devils called Amerikansky Ziteli, American inhabitants, minute globulins of glass riding up and down in glass tubes filled with pink or lilac-tinted alcohol as real Americans do, though all the epithet meant was outlandish, in the shafts of transparent skyscrapers as the office lights go out in the greenish sky. The excitement in the streets made one drunk with desire for the woods and the fields. Tamara and I were especially eager to return to our old haunts. But all through April her mother kept wavering between renting the same cottage again and economically staying in town. Finally, under certain condition accepted by Tamara with the fortitude of Hans Andersen's Little Mermaid, the cottage was rented, and a glorious summer immediately enveloped us, and there she was, my happy Tamara, on the points of her toes, trying to pull down the racemosa branch in order to pick its placard fruit, with all the world and its trees wheeling in the orb of her laughing eye, and a dark patch from her exertions on the sun forming under her raised arm on the raw shantung of her yellow frock. We lost ourselves in mossy woods, and bathed in a fairy tale cove, and swore eternal love by the crowns of flowers that, like all little Russian mermaids, she was so fond of wearing. And early in the fall she moved to town in search of a job. This was the condition set by her mother, and in the course of the following months I did not see her at all, engrossed as I was in a kind of varied experience which I thought an elegant literature should seek. I had already entered an extravagant phase of sentiment and sensuality that was to last about 10 years. In looking at it from my present tower, I see myself at 100 different young men at once, all pursuing one changeable girl in a series of simultaneous and overlapping love affairs, some delightful, some sordid, that ranged from one-night adventures to protracted involvements and dissimulations with very meager artistic results. Not only is the experience in question and the shadows of all those charming ladies useless to me now in recomposing my past, but it creates a bothersome defocalization, and no matter how I worry the screws of memory, I cannot recall the way Tamara and I parted. There is possibly another reason, too, for this blurring. We had parted too many times before. During that last summer in the country, we used to part forever after every secret meeting, when in the fluid blackness of night, on that old wooden bridge between masked moon and misty river, I would kiss her warm, wet eyelids and rain-chilled face, and immediately after go back to her for yet another farewell, and then the long, dark, wobbly uphill ride, my slow, laboriously paddling feet trying to press down the monstrously strong and resilient darkness that refused to stay under. I do remember, however, with heart-breaking vividness, a certain evening in the summer of 1917, when, after a winter of incomprehensible separation, I chanced to meet Tamara on a suburban train. For a few minutes, between two stops, in the vestibule of a rocking and rasping car, we stood next to each other, and I in a state of intense embarrassment, of crushing regret, she consuming a bar of chocolate, methodically breaking off small hard bits of the stuff, and talking of the office where she worked. On our side of the tracks, above bluish bogs, the dark smoke of burning past peat was mingling with the smoldering wreck of a huge amber sunset. It can be proved, I think, by polished records, that Alexander Blok was even then noting in his diary the very peat smoke I saw in the wrecked sky. There was later a period in my life when I might have found this relevant to my last glimpse of Tamara, when she turned on the steps to look back at me before descending into the jasmine-scented, cricket-mad dusk of a small station. But today no alien marginalia can dim the purity of the pain.